They say a man falls only once in his life, but I learned that's a lie. The first time was when my body hit the dirt behind my horse. The second was when I turned my head and saw who had pushed me. It wasn't the stumble of a child. It wasn't clumsy play. It was Brandon's small hand steady, deliberate pressed against my back, as if testing how easily the old tree would topple. 9 years old and already cruel. Where do children learn cruelty, if not at home? If you feel like this story might reach you somehow, follow the channel. That way, you help me bring more stories like this, and we grow with every life we learn from. I remember the dust rising around me, the horse snorting, hooves stamping in panic. I remember the laughter light, careless, cut short when they saw I wasn't laughing. My shoulder screamed with the pain the surgeon had warned me about, and the earth pressed its lesson deep into my ribs. I waited for Anthony, my son, to run toward me. He didn't. He stood, arms crossed, as though he were watching the evening news. And Linda, perfect Linda, her glass of wine never spilling a drop, smiled like the fall had been part of the show. No one moved. Not a hand, not a word. The silence was louder than the horse's cry. "Get up, Grandpa," Brandon said finally. "Don't be so dramatic." Dramatic. That was the word. I, who had bled to build this farm, who had kept the books balanced and the fences mended, reduced to a caricature. An actor in a play whose audience had already chosen the villain. I stood, slowly, stubbornly, brushing dirt from my palms. My heart was pounding, not from the fall, but from the clarity that arrived with it. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were waiting to see if I would stay down. I didn't give them the pleasure. That night, in the bathroom mirror, water dripping from the cuts on my arm, I studied the ghost staring back. Not the proud man I once was, but a relic, disposable, replaceable, forgotten before the chair cooled beneath me. So I opened my journal, the one I had abandoned months ago, and I wrote 7 words. They will never push me again. The next morning, I poured myself coffee. My hand shook, not from weakness, but from restraint. Anthony muttered a half-hearted morning without looking up from his phone. Linda was already on the phone with her friends, discussing some resort in Cancun. Brandon tossed crumbs to the dog, eyes bright, like cruelty was now his favorite game. I watched him, every word, every gesture, every silence. And I decided something. I would no longer raise my voice. I would no longer plead for respect. I would no longer play the role they'd written for me, convenient, compliant, silent. Instead, I would do what they least expected. I would vanish in plain sight. They believed I was a man waiting for the end. They believed they were heirs to my silence. They believed wrong, because when the time comes, and it will, they won't inherit the land, the money, the name. They will inherit only the silence I leave behind. And the silence will weigh more than gold. The push had been subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who had not felt the sudden imbalance of a body suspended between earth and saddle. But to him, it was enough to ignite something that would not be extinguished. As he reached for the leather strap to hoist himself onto the horse that morning, the force came from behind, brief, sharp, deliberate. It sent him stumbling awkwardly against the animal's flank, his fingers scraping the coarse hair, his pride scraping even harder against the unseen malice of the gesture. He caught himself before falling, managed to mount, but the echo of that push traveled deeper than muscle or bone. It was a message, quiet yet thunderous. You are not welcome. You are vulnerable. You are a burden to those who once called you family. For days afterward, he replayed the moment in his mind with obsessive clarity. The angle of the sun, the way the dust hung in the air, the sound of laughter, or was it only in his imagination? He could not be certain anymore, because memory is treacherous, capable of inventing echoes where silence once lived. Yet he knew with unshakable certainty that the push had not been an accident. A stumble might be misfortune, but the weight behind his ribs had been intention. And intention was something a man like him could not dismiss lightly. He had built his life upon reading intention of animals, of land, of markets, of storms. A farmer learns early that survival depends less on strength than on perception, on seeing before others see, on preparing before others think to prepare. A cloud on the horizon, a shift in the wind, a hesitation in the gait of a horse. Each is a message, And so too was this push. It was not merely flesh against flesh. It was prophecy. At night he lay awake, listening to the faint creak of the wooden beams above his bed, the distant rustle of trees bending to the wind, and he felt the push again, as if the act itself had lodged beneath his skin. He did not speak of it, not to his wife, who had long since stopped asking why his eyes carried storms, not to his children, who lived in that uneasy distance where respect and estrangement overlap. Certainly not to his grandchildren, for whom he was already a relic of fading patience. But silence did not diminish it. Silence only gave it roots. The farm itself began to change in his eyes. Corridors that had once felt familiar became narrow, conspiratorial. He noticed shadows where before there had been only shade. Conversation seemed to stop when he entered, laughter to scatter like guilty birds. Perhaps it was only his mind feeding upon itself, but perception has a way of becoming reality when repeated often enough. He began to catalog glances, to measure pauses in speech, to weigh the weight of casual gestures. And everywhere he found evidence slight, evasive, yet enough to confirm the whisper his bones already knew. There was a campaign against him, quiet but merciless. The push had not been an isolated act of cruelty. It was a spark leaking from a greater fire, one that smoldered behind closed doors, one that would eventually engulf him if he did not act. He imagined meetings at night, whispered conversations fueled by greed, impatience, resentment. Perhaps it was about inheritance, perhaps about control, perhaps simply about the inevitable decay of his body. He was, after all, an old man. Old men are easy to erase. Easier still when their absence can be dressed as natural decline. But he was not ready to be erased. Something hardened in him during those sleepless nights. He had spent a lifetime enduring droughts, debts, betrayals of markets and governments alike. He had bent but never broken. And now, in the waning years of his life, when he should have been allowed to fade with dignity, someone had dared to treat him as if he were already gone. That was the insult. Not the push itself, but what it represented. That he had become invisible, disposable, a shadow waiting to be absorbed by the dark. So he began to observe with renewed precision. He moved slower, not from weakness but from calculation, letting them believe his bones were heavier than they truly were. He listened more than he spoke, storing fragments of conversation like seeds. He tested loyalties with small requests, watching who answered promptly, who hesitated, who ignored. Every detail became evidence, every hesitation a clue. He was constructing a map, though none around him realized it. The grandchildren still came to the farm, though less often than before. They carried the restlessness of youth, their eyes fixed on the glow of distant cities. Their laughter filled with impatience for a man who lived in rhythms of soil and seasons. Yet even they, in their carelessness, provided pieces of the puzzle. A question about the land here, a remark about ownership there. Words tossed like stones into water, leaving ripples that reached him even when they had forgotten what they said. And then there were his children. They wore politeness like masks, speaking to him in tones that imitated respect but lacked its weight. He noticed the way they sometimes exchanged glances when he spoke too long, the way they sighed quietly when he insisted on old rituals. He knew those signs. They were not new. They were the same signs he had once seen in men plotting to divide land, to betray partners, to walk away with more than their share. Greed is a language older than any family tie, and he had become fluent in it. Still, he waited, because timing is everything. A man who survives long enough to become old learns that battles are not won by striking first, but by striking last. When the enemy believes the fight has already been won, he was patient. He let the days pass, feeding the suspicion until it grew into certainty. He let them underestimate him, let them believe he was retreating into senility, into frailty. He carried the mask of age like armor, but beneath the armor, he sharpened his resolve. The push had been the beginning. The rest would come inevitably, because malice, once revealed, never retreats. And when it came, he would be ready not as the old man they imagined, but as the strategist he had always been. He would not shout. He would not beg. He would not even accuse. He would plan quietly, meticulously, and when the moment arrived, his answer would not be a stumble or a fall. It would be a reckoning. And so the days passed, outwardly ordinary, inwardly brimming with preparation. He rose at dawn, walked the fields with slow steps, and no one suspected that with every step he was measuring more than soil. He was measuring betrayal. He ate at the table, surrounded by polite smiles, and no one guessed that he was tasting not only food, but the bitterness of disloyalty. He prayed at night, whispering words that carried less the plea of faith than the vow of endurance. He was waiting. He was watching. And though they did not yet know it, so were they. The days that followed the push at the stables unfolded like a slow-burning fire, quiet on the outside, yet consuming everything inside the mind of old Don Alvaro. For the rest of the family, it was just another trivial accident, a stumble, a slip, perhaps even a sign that the patriarch's bones had finally begun betraying him with the cruel weight of age. But to Alvaro, it was something far more deliberate, far more insidious. He could still feel the press of the hand on his back, the unmistakable shove that sent him reeling forward as he tried to mount the horse. The world had tilted violently, and though he managed to catch himself before hitting the ground, the humiliation clung to him like sweat. At first, he said nothing. The grandfather had built his entire life on silence in business, silence in marriage, silence even in moments of deepest betrayal. He believed silence gave him power. Words, once spoken, could never be recalled. But silence gave him time. Silence gave him distance. Silence gave him control. Yet, this time, silence was different. It was not a tool. It was a cage. And inside that cage, Alvaro began to suffocate. For nights, he could not sleep. The farmhouse that had once been his sanctuary felt like a stranger's house. He walked the halls with a lantern, his shadow crawling across the walls like a reminder that he was slowly fading into irrelevance. His children did not seek his advice anymore. His grandchildren laughed in corners, mocking his outdated opinions. Even Felicia, his daughter-in-law, moved through the estate with the confidence of someone who knew the old man's reign was coming to an end. The push was not just a physical act, it was a symbol. Someone wanted him out of the saddle, literally and metaphorically, and that realization began to gnaw at him. Alvaro had always believed himself to be a fair man. Stern, yes. Demanding without question, but fair. He had inherited the land from his father, expanded it with grit, sweat, and an unrelenting. He survived droughts, floods, and the betrayals of so-called partners who tried to cheat him in the cattle business. He outlived wars and market crashes. And now, in his twilight years, to be treated as a fragile relic, no, worse, as an obstacle in his own household, was a wound deeper than any he had sustained in a lifetime of battles. One morning, as he sat by the veranda overlooking the fields, Alvaro saw his grandson Diego laughing while holding the reins of the very horse Alvaro had been about to ride on the day of the incident. The horse, a black stallion named Relampago, had always been Alvaro's favorite, stubborn and fierce, just like him. Now Diego pulled at the reins roughly, mocking the animal's resistance, showing off his dominance to the younger cousins. A sharp, cold anger filled the old man's chest. Was it Diego? Was it his own blood who had tried to humiliate him? Or was it another? The uncertainty was worse than the injury itself, but something inside him stirred. It was not resignation. It was not despair. It was something older, primal, a whisper that told him, "You are not done yet." The awakening did not come all at once, but in fragments. He began to notice details he had ignored before. Felicia's tone when she addressed him, filled with polite contempt. The way his son Ernesto, once obedient and deferential, now avoided his eyes. The murmurs at dinner, conversations that stopped abruptly when Alvaro entered the room. Even the servants treated him with cautious pity, as though preparing themselves for the day when the old master's authority would finally crumble. One evening, while seated at the head of the table, Alvaro realized something chilling. Though he still occupied the central chair, though his presence loomed over the meal, the true gravity of power no longer rested with him. Felicia controlled the flow of conversation. Ernesto controlled the accounts of the farm. Diego controlled the laughter of the younger generation. And Alvaro, once the storm, was now merely the weathered tree battered by winds. That night, he did not sleep again. He sat in his study, a room filled with dusty ledgers and the portraits of long-dead ancestors, staring into the flames of the fireplace. His father's stern eyes glared at him from a canvas above the mantel, almost accusingly. Alvaro thought of the old stories his father used to tell of men who fought to keep their name alive, who carved their worth into the soil with sweat and blood. What would his father say if he saw Alvaro now, nearly toppled from his horse by the hands of his own kin? Would he call him weak? Would he call him blind? Or would he call him a coward for not fighting back? The question burned, and in the burning, Alvaro felt something awaken. The decision began quietly. Not a declaration, not a dramatic vow shouted into the empty air. It was a seed planted in the very soil of his humiliation. He began by listening, by watching more carefully. At breakfast, he pretended to forget names, to let his hands shake when holding the spoon. He let them believe he was fading. But behind the mask of frailty, his eyes sharpened. Every word exchanged between Felicia and Ernesto, every smirk from Diego, every nervous glance from the servants, it all went into the vault of his memory. He realized something crucial. They thought he was already gone. That was their mistake. It gave him time. It gave him cover. A turning point came when Alvaro visited the stables again, weeks after the incident. He walked slowly, his cane tapping the ground, each step deliberate. Relampago neighed at his approach, restless but eager. As Alvaro laid a wrinkled hand on the horse's mane, the animal calmed. He whispered to the stallion as he had done for decades, words of command and words of affection woven together. And in that moment, Alvaro understood that he still had allies, not just the beast before him, but allies hidden in unexpected places, loyal servants, old friends in town, and above all, his own will, sharpened now into something lethal. He straightened his back, and though his bones protested, there was power in the gesture. The land, the house, the family name, these things had been his life's work. And no push, no betrayal, no scheme of greedy heirs would take that away without a fight. The awakening was complete when Alvaro returned to his study that night and opened the old chest beneath his desk. Inside were letters, deeds, contracts, and journals spanning the history of the estate. As he ran his hand over them, he realized something. Knowledge was power. He knew where every coin had gone, where every favor had been given, where every weakness of his enemies lay buried. His children and grandchildren had underestimated him, mistaking old age for irrelevance. They thought the years had dulled his memory, but Alvaro remembered everything. That night, he made his choice. He would not confront them openly, not yet. Instead, he would plan. He would plot carefully, like a farmer preparing for harvest. And when the time came, his retribution would not be loud. It would be silent, precise, and devastating. The man they believed to be finished was only now beginning his final act. And this time, Alvaro promised himself there would be no forgiveness. The old man rose before dawn, as he had every day since the accident on the farm. But something in the air felt heavier that morning. For years, he had carried his pain in silence, like a wound hidden beneath layers of clothing, invisible to those who did not look closely. The push he had suffered that day, so small, so deceptively ordinary, had changed the trajectory of his life in ways no one could have imagined. His ribs had healed, but not quite. His pride had never fully recovered. And deep within him, a voice had grown louder, whispering that injustice could not be ignored forever. He sat at the edge of his bed, the wooden floor cold under his feet, staring at the horizon through the window. The sky was painted in hues of violet and orange, and he realized he had spent too many mornings watching the sunrise without ever feeling its warmth. His family had grown used to his silence, mistaking it for wisdom, but silence can also be the language of despair. That morning, however, he discovered that silence could break, and once it broke, nothing could be the same. He remembered his father's voice from decades earlier, strong and demanding, saying, "A man who does not defend his dignity loses it twice, once when he is wronged, and again when he accepts it." Those words had echoed faintly in his youth, like a lesson meant for another time, another place. but now they rang like a bell inside his skull, awakening something dormant. The push at the farm had not merely been an accident of clumsy hands. It had been a symbol, a declaration, perhaps, that his place in the family had been reduced to fragility, to inconvenience. The young man who had shoved him may not even have realized the cruelty of the act, but that did not matter anymore. It was not about the boy. It was about the man he himself had become in the aftermath, quiet, diminished, too willing to accept the role of a relic instead of a pillar. That morning, he decided it would end. He went down the creaking stairs with unusual determination, his cane tapping rhythmically on each wooden step. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, and the family photographs on the wall seemed to watch him as he passed. Portraits of ancestors who had fought wars, built homes, raised children in poverty and wealth alike. Their faces reminded him of a truth he had long neglected. He carried their blood, and with it, their strength. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the old oak table, the same table where his children had once eaten bread and butter before school, where arguments about harvests and debts had taken place, where laughter had echoed late into the night. That table was the heart of the house. He placed his hands upon it and whispered, "It is time." The decision was not about revenge. He was too old for revenge, and he knew it never healed. What he sought was restoration, a reclamation of dignity, not only for himself, but for the family that seemed to be drifting apart under the weight of unspoken tensions. The days that followed were marked by a quiet but undeniable transformation. He walked with a straighter back. He spoke with firmer words. At first, no one noticed. The world is slow to detect the stirring of giants. But little by little, his children and grandchildren began to sense something different. His silence was no longer the silence of defeat, but of planning. His eyes no longer looked tired, but calculating, as though each glance measured possibilities unseen by others. In his solitude, he began to map out what he called the Great Awakening. He would not confront the boy directly. That would be too small, too petty. Instead, he would create a moment so undeniable, so monumental, that the entire family would be forced to remember who he was, what he represented, and why respect was not optional but essential. At night, he wrote notes by candlelight, pages filled with memories, lessons, confessions, and warnings. He was preparing not only a plan of action, but a legacy. If his time on earth was limited, then his last act would not be of weakness, but of strength. His grandchildren would one day read those words and know that he had not been a shadow in their story, but the flame that had lit the path. The change unsettled the household. His wife, who had grown accustomed to his passive demeanor, watched him with curiosity. His children whispered among themselves, wondering why their father seemed sharper, as if a knife long forgotten had been pulled from its sheath. But no one dared ask him directly. There was something about the way he carried himself now that discouraged intrusion. He began spending hours in the stables, the very place where the push had occurred. He would touch the horses, feed them, whisper to them, and stand at the exact spot where he had stumbled that day. At first, it hurt to remember. But then, standing there each morning, he felt the pain transform into fuel. It was as if the earth itself was returning his dignity with every step he took across that ground. And then, one evening, he gathered the family at the oak table. His voice was calm, but his eyes were like steel. "I have been silent for too long," he said. "And silence, as you know, can be mistaken for weakness. But it is not weakness. It is patience. And patience is ending." The family stared, unsure of what to make of his words. The boy who had pushed him shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but the old man did not name him. Instead, he continued, "Every man reaches a moment when he must decide what kind of legacy he leaves. Mine will not be of silence. Mine will be of truth, and it begins now." No one spoke. The air was heavy, charged, almost sacred. The old man looked around the table, his gaze falling on each member of the family, as if carving his presence back into their lives. From that night onward, the house no longer felt the same. Something had shifted. The grandfather was no longer just the old man who lived among them. He was again the patriarch, the force, the mountain. His decision to rise had already begun to alter the destiny of them all. This awakening was not the end. It was the beginning of execution, of strategies that would unfold with precision. The push on the farm had started the fire, but now it was the old man himself who carried the torch. He had awakened, and the world within that household would never be able to sleep again. The sun leaned low over the horizon, spilling molten gold across the fields, as if the land itself had been anointed for a final reckoning. The farmhouse, which had stood for generations as both refuge and fortress, now seemed like a stage prepared for its last performance. Within its walls, hearts beat with an anticipation that mixed dread with release, as if everyone knew, without anyone daring to say aloud, that the hour of truth had finally arrived. Grandfather Thomas moved with a deliberate calm, his steps measured, his cane clicking against the wooden floorboards of the hall. He had chosen the evening for the execution of his plan, believing that twilight carried a weight that daylight could not hold. Morning promised new beginnings. Night was for secrecy. But evening, the slow descent into darkness, was the hour when legacies were tested, when one could no longer escape the shadows, nor claim ignorance of them. At the long dining table, the family gathered as they had 1,000 times before. But tonight, no laughter floated between the bowls and plates. No careless clinking of glasses filled the silence. Each pair of eyes searched the other for weakness, for betrayal, for reassurance that would not come. The air itself seemed swollen with suspense, every breath as fragile as glass. Grandfather stood at the head of the table, his gnarled hand resting on the back of the chair that had always been his throne. He did not sit. Instead, he drew a folded envelope from his jacket pocket, heavy with the weight of documents and decisions that could not be reversed. "My blood," he began, his voice steady but unyielding. "I have watched you quarrel like scavengers over meat not yet stripped from the bone. I have listened to your whispered bargains, your backroom deals, your promises soaked in self-interest. And I have remained silent, not out of fear, but because silence often reveals more than words." His blue eyes pierced each of them in turn, lingering, judging, yet somehow still filled with a sorrow that belonged more to a father than a patriarch. No one moved. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder, like the countdown of judgment itself. "This," he continued, raising the envelope slightly, "contains not merely wealth, but the harvest of lifetimes land tilled by hands that knew hunger. Businesses born from sweat and sleepless nights. A name that has endured storms both literal and human. And yet I can see clearly now, it is not the money you fight for, but the throne it represents. You do not hunger for bread, but for power. And so tonight, I will separate wheat from chaff." He opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, as though peeling away the skin of pretense. Inside were not stacks of legal contracts as they expected, but a single handwritten letter and a deed stamped with a fresh seal. "Who will receive this legacy?" whispered Samuel, his jaw tightening. His voice betrayed both fear and entitlement. "That depends," Grandfather said, "on whether a legacy is measured by possession or by character." He set the letter on the table. "This will be read aloud," he declared, "so that every soul present knows the weight of its words." And with that, he unfolded the letter, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, though not from weakness, but from the gravity of what it carried. The letter spoke not in the language of wealth, but of wounds and lessons. It recounted his own youthful hunger for domination, the friendships and kinships broken along the way, the slow realization that no vault, no field, no empire could shield a man from the poverty of a loveless life. It named no heir directly, but instead declared conditions, that the land would belong not to the richest or strongest, but to the one willing to care for it as a steward, not as a king. That the businesses would be given not to the shrewdest negotiator, but to the one who proved able to provide work that dignified rather than enslaved. And that the family name would endure not in law, but in the daily honor with which it was spoken. The words settled like stones on the table, their echoes reverberating in the stunned silence that followed. Faces flushed with anger, shame, confusion, every emotion except the relief that wealth had once promised. Finally, it was Amelia, the youngest granddaughter, who broke the silence. Her voice was not loud, but it was steady. Then it will not be all of us, only one of us. Her eyes shone with something the others had not expected. Not greed, but clarity. No, grandfather corrected gently. It can be all of you, or none. That choice is yours. He turned then, walking to the window where the last embers of sunset melted into night. I am old, he confessed, his shoulders slumping slightly for the first time, and I will soon leave you. I cannot control what you do after my breath leaves this house, but I can strip away your illusions. Wealth cannot heal betrayal. Power cannot manufacture love. Only truth remains, whether you embrace it or flee from it. That night, some stormed away, muttering about fairness and legality, already plotting battles in courts of law. Others lingered, broken by the revelation that what they had pursued most fiercely was now slipping like sand through their fingers. But only a few remained seated, their eyes lowered, as though struck by the sudden possibility that the inheritance they truly needed was not land or money, but reconciliation, humility, and the courage to live differently than they had before. The plan was complete. Grandfather had not chosen an heir. He had chosen a mirror, and in that mirror, each soul saw itself reflected, naked of pretense. Some could not bear the sight and turned away, but for those who dared to look, a new kind of wealth was born. For Samuel, the eldest, the lesson was bitter, that ambition untempered by compassion leaves a man empty-handed, no matter how tightly he grasps. For Amelia, it was liberating. The youth need not wait for permission to shape a legacy. It could begin by showing honesty and faithfulness in small, daily acts. For the family as a whole, it was sobering that blood ties can strangle as easily as they can bind, unless watered with trust and truth. And for Thomas himself, the weary patriarch, it was finally restful that his role had not been to dictate, but to awaken, to turn the soil of hardened hearts one last time before his own rest. As dawn broke the next day, the farm stood unchanged fields stretching endlessly, the barn creaking in the wind, the house holding its secrets. But within those walls, nothing remained the same. A battle had ended, not with victors or vanquished, but with revelations that would echo for generations. The harvest had been gathered. Whether they saw it as grain or as ash was no longer in his hands. Thank you for staying with me and listening this far. Your attention is a gift. Did these minutes mean something to you? Then please, follow the channel. Every click from you is a push that helps me keep bringing stories that truly stay with us.